Left
or do
or
this?
yeah.
Or do you prefer that I sit?
No, it's okay. Just
I can hold it. And I have to speak like this.
No.
Bonjour à tous, bienvenue sur Unimix. Sur Unimix, la radio des étudiants de Fribourg. Unimix.
Well, hello everybody. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back at the Unimix studio. Today, for this new Parenthèse Académique, I have the pleasure to have by my side Lou.
Hello.
Thank you, Lou, for coming back at the radio.
No worries. Always a pleasure.
And I also have the pleasure to welcome in the studio the senior lecturer, Mr. Oswald.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming and sharing your passion for linguistics here with us today.
I try.
So, I had Alizé Lombard, who teaches French linguistics in the university, in Fribourg as well. Since when have you been teaching linguistics here?
This year it's going to be 10 years. I started in 2013.
Okay, yeah.
So I started here as an assistant doctor, and I'm still here.
And since when did you know that you wanted to dive into linguistics?
So probably my second year as an undergrad, I studied in Geneva. And I didn't take linguistics as a first subject, as a major at first. But by the end of the first year, I made it so that I could study linguistics as a major. And that's when I knew that this is what was of actual academic interest to me. But I've had an interest for language as far as I can remember.
Mm-hmm. And why specifically in English linguistics?
So that is a bit of a coincidence in the sense that in Geneva I studied general linguistics. So it's not the linguistics of a given language, but linguistics as a system, as a human feature, as something general to study about the human nature. And that means that I was taught stuff about phenomena in Turkish phonology, about stuff in Spanish, about stuff in English, stuff in French. So I'm a generalist by training, if you want. And then that makes me presumably eligible for jobs which welcome people who don't have a specific focus, but that can be in the Department of English. I could do that in the Department of French. In fact, in a past life, I was for 2 years working in the Department of French Linguistics in Amsterdam. But I could also do that in Spanish because I speak Spanish, so that would make me able to teach. But so it's not like I have one language that I focus on specifically. It's just communication and language in general, and then we can look at different languages like that. So I applied here because there was a position. I thought that I could bring something to the job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because throughout the interviews, I've seen that it's really a small world, the academic world, and it's hard to find a place. Just for the auditors, what exactly is a senior lecturer?
So a senior lecturer is someone who teaches pretty much the same thing as professors. So professors who hold a chair in a given department. Senior lecturers also do research. They also have some admin tasks. So for instance, I maintain the website of the English department. I sit in committees. For a while I was responsible for the BA and MA programs at the department. So I can do all these things, but there are some things that I don't do. So I cannot be head of department, I cannot participate to the faculty council. All the tasks that professors might sometimes say are boring and very time consuming, I have the luck of not having to do that. so yeah. But in the end, I teach pretty much the same thing as as what a professor would teach, and I do research just like them. I can also supervise PhD students, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you're totally free to choose whatever you want to teach?
So that is always something you need to discuss in agreement with your superior. And in this case, the professor of English linguistics, we agree on a program that is compatible with the study plan, with the interests of the department, and then we decide on what I can teach. But I'm quite free in the sense that I can bring to the table new ideas. Say if I want to develop a new class, I've done that a couple of years ago when I got my first research project, which was on implicit meaning and argumentation. I wanted to teach a seminar, MA level, that was related to that. And then I discussed it with the professor, and he was in agreement, and I could teach it.
Do you have are you specialized in a certain domain within linguistics? Or are you just, as you said, you're a generalist, but are there still certain elements of linguistics that interest you more or less?
Yes, of course. So I'm a generalist, meaning I can teach presumably different things in linguistics. So right now I'm going to teach this semester a class in phonetics and phonology, also something on humor, something on implicit meaning, something on misrepresentation, but I can teach also on discourse analysis, politeness, and deception, argumentation, different things. That's for teaching. But for research, yeah, of course, I have my area of expertise and of interest, and that's pragmatics. Pragmatics is, well, halfway, you know, it's a bit of pragmatics and a bit of argumentation. Pragmatics is the study of meaning in context, so the way people understand each other when they actually speak or communicate. Usually pragmatics is opposed to semantics, traditionally, semantics being the study of meaning as it is inscribed in the linguistic system in a stable way, in a conventional way, so the meaning of words basically, but also when you build it up in sentences. Pragmatics would look at what meanings emerge when sentences, grammatical sentences, are uttered in a situation by someone, for someone, with a given purpose. That's the realm of pragmatics. So that's where I have fun.
Yeah, because what was the name of the group that you're part of? Korea?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, that's the Collectif Roman de Recherche en Argumentation, représente. So that's an informal group that we founded in 2013 in Brussels, actually, at a conference. It was co-founded by myself, Thierry Herman in Neuchâtel, Jérôme Jacquin in Lausanne, and back then Raphaël Micheli, who was also in Lausanne. And it's basically us four thinking we have a strong interest in argumentation, so how people argue, how they exchange reasons for their standpoints. And we like to approach it through the lens of the language sciences, linguistics and pragmatics in particular. And we thought, let's just get together and do something. And that emerged, well, that resulted in the organization of a conference, which was called Argumentation and Language. And the first edition took place in Lausanne in 2015, the second 3 years later in Lugano in 2018, then 3 years later in Neuchâtel, so that was 2 years ago in 2021, and the next one is going to be in Fribourg in 2024. So there will be a conference on argumentation and language in June 2024 here.
Excellent. And so you're researching into rhetorical tools, kind of, yeah, and especially in false. How do you say it already? False argumentation? No.
Fallacies.
Fallacies. Yes, right.
Yes, indeed. So, in my already in what would be my MA thesis, but there weren't any masters or bachelors back then. So I did a licence, and I did a memoir on manipulation in the speeches of Juan Domingo Perón, who was a political leader in Argentina. And I was interested in manipulation, and then I kept that for my PhD thesis, which was on cooperativeness in discourse and manipulation and deception. And there was a part devoted to the study of fallacious arguments. So arguments which are presented as sound, but whose conclusion doesn't follow the premises, from the premises. And I worked on that in different ways, and that is part of my research, yes. So I was always interested in figuring out why people ended up accepting things that they shouldn't based on what was said. So I'm always interested in those kind of dysfunctions, or you might call them dysfunctions, or interesting cases where things happen and they shouldn't, in the interest of people. So.
And now that you raised awareness about that, do you spot them every day, or?
So yes, but that's interesting because I always look for examples for my classes. So every time I find something, I mark it down. I keep the source. I can use it afterwards. But yeah, it's actually quite fun when you listen to a politician and you say, wait a minute, and you play it again and say, no, that doesn't add up, and then you can explain why and how. And that's interesting because research is about understanding why, understanding how, and knowing what. And if you ask those questions, then you start looking at things and paying more attention. And if you can relate that to whatever your academic interests are, I find that always interesting. So.
Mm-hmm. Are you less easily manipulated in that case, or do you just spot them, but it still has the same effect on you?
So the claim I defended in my PhD thesis was that manipulation works because the way we process information as humans, as cognitive systems, is fallible. That is, we can go wrong. We make mistakes, right? And so by studying those, yes, you are probably more aware, but I'm still likely to be manipulated. Ask my kids. You have to have reasons to be, skeptical. That helps. So, of course, if you listen to the speech of a politician that you don't particularly like, you are going to be, very vigilant. If it comes from someone you are very appreciative of, or if someone you trust, then your vigilance might be lower. And so those are the cases in which something can go wrong, really. But yeah, just because I study it doesn't mean I will never fall victim to that. And it certainly doesn't mean that I'm good at it. So I wouldn't... There are also moral implications in manipulating people. And I'm not really a big promoter of those.
Good to hear. I just had another question, which is a bit more general, but we didn't even start with that. But could you define linguistic for someone? What is linguistics for someone who just came to university and who sees it on the study plan and who just thinks, "Oh no, I was here to study Shakespeare"?
Yeah. So linguistics is the study of language as not as French or German or Spanish or Turkish or whatever, but the study of the system that we all share that allows us to communicate. So of course you can do linguistics in different languages, and you can in this department, in the English department where I work, you would typically look at phenomena of English. Just like in the French department, you would typically look at phenomena in French, and in the Italian department, phenomena in Italian. But it's really about understanding that the way we speak is not random, that it's a system that you can describe in different layers, different levels. You start with sounds, they combine to each other to produce chunks of words, morphemes. These combine together to produce words. These combine together to produce sentences, or phrases or clauses, and then sentences, and then utterances. So there's a whole array of levels of description that are systematic. So there's not randomness behind language. There are things that you cannot do in English. For instance, you cannot have an initial sequence of f and p in a word in English. There are no words that start with f. That doesn't exist. And there are things that you do in a way that makes sense and that is patterned. So for instance, in English you have 3 different plurals, right? The sound, depending on the word. So you have 1 mug, 2 mugs. You have 1 cat, 2 cats. And you have 1 bus, 2 buses. And so you have s, z, and is as possible realizations of the plural. Turns out there are rules behind that, and if you know English, then you have internalized these rules. They are very easy to describe. They have to do with the sound that precedes. Depending on the sounds that is before the plural, you would have either s, z, or is. And linguistics is about explaining that and describing how it works, because as I said, it's not random. And all languages have rules, all languages have ways of doing things. Some of them are more free than others, and that's part of linguistic description. So linguistics would be the description of language as a system that we use to communicate. And then there are different domains and areas of interest that you can study. Here in Fribourg, in English linguistics, we focus a lot on pragmatics, so what you do with language in communication. So we talk about humor, we talk about metaphors, irony, meaning in general. That's a big area of focus. But there are other departments, for instance in Bern, in English linguistics, you do a lot of world Englishes. So they study different varieties of English. The variety they speak in, I don't know, Guam, for instance. I was talking to someone who did her PhD on the English variety of that they speak in Guam, which is an island in the Pacific. Then they focus on differences with other types or varieties of English. You can also study that. There's tons of things you can study about language, really, depending on where your interests lie. If you're more interested by psychology, by sociology, by philosophy, even by biology, you can look at language in those areas. So it's a very encompassing field. And one thing that I would say, for someone who goes to university to study humanities, well, linguistics is probably the most scientific-oriented branch in the humanities, arguably. Which is probably why I went there too. So.
and how, with your experience, how receptive are the students when they're confronted to linguistics at first?
So if I look at my own experience, I was very receptive because I studied university. I didn't know what linguistics was. I was never told about linguistics in high school, and I just basically ended up in a class of linguistics in 1998 because I went to the informative session. They have these stands where they explain what every department is doing, and I went there and I checked it out and I thought, this is interesting, and I decided to start. For me, it was an easy choice actually because I was interested in language anyway. And but for others, I think one way of getting, I won't say students hooked, but interested at least, is to show them that this is something that they do on a regular basis. I remember when I was in Neuchâtel as a PhD student, that's where I did my PhD, we were asked to go to high schools to promote linguistics so that we then would recruit students. And I remember that I basically went there and drew their attention on the fact that even if they don't realize it, they use a lot of implicit meaning, and that this isn't straightforward. So I just, very discreetly said, "Does anyone have the time?" And then someone said, "It's 10:30." I said, "Aha." I asked if someone had the time. I didn't ask you to give me the time, but then you understood that I wanted the time. How is that possible? How do you understand something that I haven't said? Why do you go there to a meaning that I haven't verbalized explicitly? And then you make people aware that the way they communicate is not really straightforward. We're not machines, right? We don't have one, language doesn't work by one symbol has one meaning. It's much more complicated than that. And once you draw attention to the fact that we shouldn't take for granted what we do without even thinking about it, then that might spark some interest. That's at least how I did it. And it seems to be working. Because when people realize, oh yeah, you're right, I hadn't thought about that, that's when you have piqued someone's interest.
Excellent, yeah. And so you teaches, teaches. Oh, yes. Well, what am I saying?
You teach?
You teach, yes. I did. No.
I can teach you if you want. I can understand it.
Well, technically, if we think so, I know that linguistic is not like studying and saying, oh, you shouldn't say that in English. It's just taking a picture and describing it's not normative.
Mm-hmm.
Why did you say you teach us, for example?
Exactly, yeah.
It was to prime the question.
Probably.
There's the distinction between normative approaches and prescriptive, prescriptive approaches and descriptive approaches. And anyone in the right mind, in the right linguistic mind, will say, well, normative this is for the French Academy who says you should say this. And then they slap you on the fingers if you say it wrong. Yeah, I mean, what makes sense is to see what people do and how they get along linguistically, so how they can succeed in communicating, whether they make mistakes or not. Of course, when I hear things, sometimes my ears bleed. But that's not a reason to be all arrogant. And I mean, if people get the message across, that's fine. That is really what matters, that people understand each other. And I think that, of course, there are misunderstandings, but on a regular basis, it seems to me to be the case that people understand each other more often than not. And I don't mean understand like accept people's motivations, but just simply get what they mean, right? That sense of understanding, comprehension. And it seems to me that even if there are difficulties, sometimes usually we get the job done.
You get the message across, yeah.
I mean, it's always funny to make fun of people who mispronounce things. I have done that in the past, but I mean, academically, that's not the purpose that a study of language should follow, right? Should try to fulfill. Just saying how things are, trying to understand why they are the way they are. So, when children make mistakes, when they acquire language, that's an indication of how their minds work with respect to handling that language. So they might over-generate. So for instance, if a child in French would say j'ai prendu instead of j'ai pris, it means that they have internalized something. Just like I taked instead of I took. It means that the child has understood that there's a rule to transform a verb in the past form, only they don't know yet that there are some verbs which don't work like that. But it's still an indication that something's happening, right? So in that respect, it's interesting.
Oh, you wanted? Oh no, okay. Well, but as well in linguistic, we're looking into what people say, but as well what people aren't saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought Blue wanted to say something, but I misinterpreted.
Basically, the second part of the interview will be an analysis on the first part of the interview. But yeah, no, I just wanted to... I thought you had another question. That's why.
Well, there's work on silence too in linguistics. I mean, look at what's his name? This American talk show host.
Jimmy Fallon?
No,
the other one.
Sorry,
the other one.
There's like 5 or 6. Yeah. Not Colbert, not Trevor Noah, not Jimmy Fallon, not Kimmel, not Letterman. The other one. And he uses silence a lot when before he delivers the punchline of his joke, or just as the punchline. So the absence of a contribution when you would expect one can also be very meaningful, right? Accompanied with eyebrows going like this, or a persistent gaze, or something like that. We make sense of each other's behavior, and that's not only with the words that people use. We include much more in it too.
And what was your favorite class to teach?
That's an interesting question. So in general, a class where I see that students are not bored, that's always a plus. It depends on many things. It depends on the group that you have in front of you. Sometimes you can have a class of 70 students, which is extremely lively and engaged, or a class of 70 students which is completely not engaged, and the same with small groups. I'd say that the ones that I really enjoyed most were the ones where there was interest from the students. So probably the classes on humor, that's usually draws a bit of people because it's probably sexier than it was if I was teaching the phonology of English, for instance. But I strangely enough, I do enjoy the phonology class because it's really basic in the sense that we're looking at how we pronounce sounds. So what is different between f and v, right? As basic as that. And when people realize, it's always nice because they, and it's just contributing to that. There's always, when, just like in humor actually, there's always a moment where you see the person getting it, right? And that's really rewarding because you know that there's something that changed. Even if, I mean, it's completely inconsequential in their lives, it's still something intellectually that at one point happened. And I'm always looking for that. So usually when I have classes on either political discourse or humor or things that also can be related to day-to-day life outside of academia, that usually is quite enjoyable.
Mm-hmm. And so you also analyze political discourse, but isn't it complicated? How do you handle not having an opinion on the discourse?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. To what extent can we be unbiased and objective? So as long as you use a framework of analysis that can be used for the analysis of language in general, not specifically political discourse, you can stay on the safe side. I mean, of course, Trump was a very easy target because everyone hates him. Well, at least in the classes that I had, they seemed to be not really pro-Trump. And the other thing is that it might be unfair, but what he says is of great interest because rhetorically, pragmatically, there's a lot of stuff going on there. He's a really good communicator. I mean, good in the sense that he makes an impression. I'm not saying that he is successful at convincing people or that he is successful as getting likes or being appreciated, but he's successful at getting and keeping the spotlight. And he's an extremely good conversationalist. He can maneuver his way around any conversation and be relevant and outrageous too. But that's also a form of conversational skill in a sense, right? And so I try usually to clarify at the beginning that I'm not interested in people's opinions, what students think, what people whose speeches we're going to be analyzing think, but I'm interested in linguistic and pragmatic phenomena, stuff that has to do with meaning. And if you try to keep that focus, you can hope to, I mean, I don't care about if I have a MAGA fan, so Make America Great Again fan, or a Democrat in my class, it's the same thing. Maybe they, depending on how vocal they are, they will try to disagree or agree with the analysis that we do together. But it's always an opportunity to discuss things. And even, you know, if there is a scientific aspect to the study of language, we can still put it forward and say, well, in this case, you know, let's look at a text by this other speaker who represents a different opinion with the same tools, and then see what we can get. Presumably, this is possible, right? Of course, so there's a branch of the language sciences, linguistics, called discourse analysis, and in particular, critical discourse analysis or critical discourse studies. And people who work in that field, they have a political agenda, which they think is not at all incompatible with objectivity. And so the idea is that, we're losing a speaker. The idea is that presumably you could analyze political discourse on the left and on the right in the same way. It is, it's a question, you know, where your political opinions lie in, sorry, in that kind of analysis. But I think that there are ways of not making this a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now we can do the break.
Now we can do the break, okay. Or make a commercial break? Or
Join Unimix.
This message is brought to you.
And so I've seen as well that you participated a lot in other media forms. Mm-hmm. You were interviewed by other journalists. But isn't it hard sometimes to explain linguistics to those who aren't in academia? Like they don't understand that there are specific linguistic categories?
So, from experience, I'm always a bit frustrated because you talk for a lot of time and then what's kept is quite fragmentary and small. But that's fine, I understand it. What I do is I never accept an invitation for which I don't really know what to say. So it has to be something that I can talk about in my capacity of someone who has done research on related topics. So sometimes I have said, no, sorry, I cannot do this because it doesn't fall in my area of expertise. Then the challenge, once you do accept something, an invitation, the challenge is to make it accessible. So that's then rhetoric. You have to, I guess, take examples and try to be as clear as possible. Sometimes when it's for print, the journalists would send you what they intend to put in the interview or in the article, and then you can give your opinion, and sometimes I can correct a couple of things or misconceptions. It's not really a big deal usually. So, but yeah, it's so what I have on my side is that the topics I'm dealing with are quite well known and familiar. So I did a few things on memes and humor in political discourse, and that's something that people see independently of university or not. So what I do is I just bring that under a different light that people might not know, and try to make it accessible. So that's easier, I guess, than going to an interview and talk about the clitic doubling in the Spanish variety of the Rio de la Plata, for instance. I don't see how Le Temps would be interested in that. If you're interested, it's the fact that in that variety of Spanish you have a doubling of the pronoun in the direct-indirect objects. So you would say something like, I gave him an apple to John.
Oh,
Okay.
And would that to insist that it was to John, or just?
No, it's standard.
Oh, the other version doesn't exist. It's just the double.
They would have the other version too,
Okay.
but they routinely and consistently use the double version.
Okay.
That's in Argentina and Uruguay.
Okay.
Le di una manzana a Juan.
Do you know if there are specificities for L2 Swiss learners, or?
That's not at all my topic
Oh,
of
yeah.
research. I mean, of course, there are things, very simply put. So, for instance, if I had to learn Cantonese or an Asian language that has tones, that would be a nightmare for me, specifically because my native language doesn't have them. And so it's a difficult thing to figure out later in life. So that would be a specific thing for me. Someone who has tones in their language would probably pick that up very quickly. Same way my grandmother tried to learn Spanish in her 60s, and she was never able to say r. So it was always a r, and she could never get it. And that's specific to the fact that she was born and raised, well, she was raised as a native French speaker, and she never had to produce that sound in her day-to-day life. And after a certain age, you just lose the ability of being able to sound like a native speaker, for instance. But that's just for phonology and phonetics of the way you pronounce sounds. But there are other difficulties. So in French, we don't really have cases, like genitive, datif, ablatif, all of that. And it can be tricky for a speaker of French to learn a language that has them, because simply they're not used to them in their own language. Whereas someone who comes from a language that has those features might find it easier. Right? So I don't think there's a particularly difficult or easy language to learn, because it all depends on where you're coming from, what kind of features your own language has, and if they're similar to the target language. So it might be easier for me to learn Portuguese than for someone who comes from Japan. Just like it might be easier for someone who comes from Japan to learn a language that I would have a nightmare with.
So if I understand it correctly, you speak English, French, and Spanish.
Yeah, I do.
In your native languages?
French.
French.
We spoke French at home.
Okay.
But I grew up in South America.
Okay.
So that's why I speak Spanish.
Okay.
How was the experience back there?
So I was born in Basel, but I left. So my family left and took me with. Kind enough to leave me behind. We went to Colombia for 3.5 years, then to Mexico for 2.5 years, then shortly back to Switzerland, to Basel for 2 or 3 years, and then to Argentina. And I grew up in basically my from when I was 10 to nearly 19, I was in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And I had a blast. It was fun. I had a privileged life in the sense that my dad was an expat, so he was the provider for the family, and we never had any problems in that respect. And I really enjoyed, I don't remember much about Colombia because I was small. Mexico a bit more, and then Argentina. Yeah, that's my teenage years, so you remember these things.
And would you have considered going back there to teach?
Yeah. So I was very happy in 2014. I was invited to give a series of talks in Chile in Spanish, and that was really cool because it was the first time I was doing my job in Spanish. And then went to Costa Rica too. Nice invitation. And I never really actively considered going to work professionally. So, as a linguist there at a university. I don't know why. So I studied in Neuchâtel, my PhD. So I studied my undergrad in Geneva. I did my PhD in Neuchâtel. When I was doing my PhD, I went a year to Lancaster on a grant to study there. And then after my PhD thesis, I had a job in Amsterdam for 2 years in French linguistics. And that was always, I always liked to travel. Nowadays, I have a permanent position here. I have 2 kids, a house, I have a family, and So no, I don't think I would consider going back. I still have friends there, very good friends, but I don't see myself living there anymore. Mm-hmm. Maybe in my early 20s that was still an option, but nowadays,
when you're set up, it's pretty pleasant here.
Can't really complain. Have a job, that's fine.
What would be your favorite book?
In linguistics or in general?
Oh, in general.
Okay. I might disappoint my literature colleagues because I don't really read, quality literature. I'm just like with movies. I'm a very non-demanding kind of audience member. So if anything is just interesting or entertaining, I read it. So I've read all the Harlan Coben novels that I can't talk about because I forgot what they're about. Just crime stories that I know. Maybe you remember a couple of characters, but there are a couple of books that I like. So there's this book called The Seventh Function of Language by Laurent Binet. I think it's been translated to English, and it's so think of a Tarantino movie in the setting of 1970s academia in the humanities.
Okay.
And that's a very interesting read because the author also did his homework on linguistic theories. So he talks about speech act theory, he talks about semiotics, and there are famous characters in that book. Roland Barthes, Michel Foucault, John Searle, Noam Chomsky, Julia Kristeva, all these people. And it's very fun. It's a fun read.
The
seventh function of language.
I have to read that book.
I'll give it to you. I started. It's very good.
You have it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Since the class with Steve, I have it.
That's a book I like. And when I was a PhD student, I started reading the books by David Lodge, who writes about academia. So a classic is A Small World. That's the name of the book. And it's interesting because once you're no longer a student and you become part of the world of academia, you get to see things and how things work, because as a student I had no idea what was happening on the other side. I never understood or really was exposed to any of that. And then you read about it too as you go through it, so it's kind of interesting. It's a bit outdated now, so but people writing on typewriters, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
but it's quite entertaining. Yeah. And then in terms of, if we talk about aesthetic taste, I was very fond of 20th century French poetry. So people like Jacques Prévert, those were amongst my favorites. And in French literature, I really like the Daniel Pennac series on Les Malocènes. Maybe you've heard about it. That was a nice read when I was, I guess, a teenager and post-teenagers.
Because when I ask if you had a favorite book, you asked me in linguistic. Can you really have a favorite book in linguistic?
You have, I mean, if you're interested by your topic, there are things that will speak to you and things that won't.
Yeah?
Yeah.
What would be your favorite book in linguistic?
So I guess it would just be tied to the people so who wrote those books. So for me, being, you know, a scholar active in pragmatics, the work of Herbert Paul Grice is up there for me, because there was, for me, I mean, the way I see things, there was a before him and an after him in the study of meaning and use. He was the first to talk about, to put forward an inferential account of meaning, meaning that whenever you understand what someone is saying, it's not just a matter of decoding, so having, you know, the code and pairing symbols with meanings, but it's much more. It's actually making assumptions as to what people say, and figuring out that many times what they say is not what they mean, and filling the gaps to reach an understanding of what they meant. Just like I said before, you have the time. You can say it's 5 to 5. Well, I still haven't asked you to give me the time. I just asked if you had the time. So you could have said yes, but you bridged the gap to figure out that I wanted you to give me the time, even if I didn't say that. And he was one of the first to try to systematically account for that. So,
and it was him that put it forward the notions of it needs to quality, quantity. What are the two others?
Relation and so quality, quantity, relation, and manner. So those are the maxims of conversation that people seem to observe when they discuss, when they engage in conversation, and
when everything goes right.
Yes, and when they don't, but they do it intentionally, it means that there's something else to be understood. So, you know, if you say that you can run extremely fast, faster than Usain Bolt, I will look at you and say, well, I'm the Queen of England. And obviously that's not what I mean. I'm not saying something true. You know that I'm not saying something true. Therefore, you keep thinking about what I meant, and then you end up figuring out that I don't believe you. And that's what I meant by saying that I'm not the Queen of England. I mean, we do that on a regular basis. We don't need a theory to do it.
Yes.
We need a theory to explain how it works. So I'm not saying that Grice's theory was right. That's how it actually works. But it was, for me, a revolutionary way of thinking about communication.
And so when you're studying linguistic and the rhetorical aspects, do you specifically look into English, or are there some things that are specific to English?
I don't look at specificities like that. I'm more interested in the mechanism of understanding that is presumably common in to everyone, all languages, across languages. There's irony in all languages. So if I said to you, moi je suis la reine d'Angleterre, same thing, right? It's not specific to French or English. What is specific is the knowledge that you might have. Maybe someone doesn't know who the Queen of England is, and then they have trouble figuring out what you meant. But yeah, I mean, there are specificities, of course. There are ways of saying things. You've heard about the stereotype of British humor being very indirect, so much so that sometimes you don't know it's humor. So you're actually being insulted, but you don't realize it because it's so subtle and indirect that you might miss it. So certainly there are cultural things at play there, but they can be hosted within those types of theories to account more generally for meaning, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there are things, I mean, so for instance, if you think of humor, French is very good with wordplay and what they call contrepaire or contrepétrie, which is substituting two sounds in a given linguistic string to make a meaning that usually is below the belt and funny. English does have a few things like that, but it's not as developed, I think. I mean, in French, there's a book called La Bible du Contrepaire, which is this thick, and it's all about these types of jokes. I'm not sure that there's an equivalent in English. So, yeah. But maybe I'm speaking out of ignorance. Maybe there is, I don't know. As far as I know, I don't know everything.
La Bible du Contrepaire?
La Bible du Contrepaire.
Oh, I have to look.
No, please don't.
Oh, yes. I will.
Try to come up with a few examples in the class on humor.
I'm looking forward for it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, do you have? You have
I
a
had
question.
I had another question.
No, you have a question.
related to the books. Did you start by reading English literature and then you got interested by more linguistic, more linguistical elements, or did you directly fall into the linguistic? Because before you said that you weren't in that information day where you noticed linguistics, but before that, were you already interested in kind of literature or not at all?
A bit, but certainly not English literature.
Okay.
As life has it, I did a baccalaureate in a French Argentinian school, and I followed the scientific track, so I specialized in sciences de la vie et de la terre, so biology basically. But I always had an interest for humanities and words and literature-ish. But then when I got to Geneva, so in the old system we had to choose 2 majors and 1 minor, and one of the majors had to be a language. So I had a choice between Spanish and English, and of course it was salsa years, so I went for Spanish. I went to the information sessions on English, but then, I decided to settle for Spanish, and so I'd never studied English literature. Well, that's not true. I graduated from high school in '96. I was just 17, and I stayed a year in Argentina, and I attended an American university that was there, that had a partnership with Linguistics, I think it's in Florida. And basically the students could follow the first 2 years there, and then they would go to the US. And I just did 1 year, and I knew I wanted to go back to Switzerland to study, but I didn't know what. So I basically took every class I could, from psychology to sociology, astronomy, creative writing, public speaking, all of these things. And there I had a bit of English, American literature. And then when I got to Geneva, I chose Spanish. And my major actually was philosophy, because I thought, I'm going to be a thinker. When I found out all I had to read to become a thinker,
then you thought about it.
And I reconsidered, and I switched my minor and my major. I put linguistics first and philosophy as a minor. And in that process, the only stuff that I read is anything from the Middle Ages in Spanish to modern things, but never stuff in English. And I did read Shakespeare very briefly for a very little amount of time, so I'm not really proud of that, but since I'm in an English department, but my thing was language, so and words. I mean, there are many ways of making linguistics and literature collaborate. I think the professor of English linguistics has a class on linguistics for literary texts, and it's historically literature scholars have drawn a lot on linguistic models to explain and analyze texts, literary texts, which is fine and works to a certain extent. So there are definitely bridges there. I haven't focused on that because I'm more interested in discourse, not just as you can find it in fiction, but political discourse, interpersonal discourse, and so on.
It is a field that is still very different from literature studies in general. Linguistics is very different from literature studies.
Yeah, of course. Even the way, I mean, it must be a nightmare for students who are required to do both, because the style sheets are different. What is expected in an essay in literature is not what is expected in an essay in linguistics. So I can see how that can be difficult to conjugate and to deal with, and it's a very different type of study. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, excellent. Thanks a lot for all those. You
I had another question about it more. I'm sorry, I can stop if you want, but I'm just I enjoy the conversation. So
episode 1.
Yeah. There will be 40 episodes.
you will come back, Lou.
So, no, I just wanted to ask about your research. Do you have research at the moment? What do you research at the moment?
So I do. So I have two research projects, meaning that these are projects that are funded by the Swiss National Fund, and they run over a few years. So one of them is on implicit meaning in argumentation. And what we've done so far is try to see whether different kinds of implicit meaning, so for those who know implicatures, presuppositions, and so on, and we worked on insinuation, whether these different kinds of implicit meaning can be used to fulfill different rhetorical purposes. And we found that if you want to take a shot at someone and disparage them, you're better off by doing so through an insinuation than through an assertive, an explicit assertion. So saying to someone that you think they're wrong because they're stupid is not as rhetorically effective, persuasive in a way, as saying, I think you're wrong because you have a strange relationship with intelligence, which means you're stupid, but in an insinuated way, right? Because you can always deny it. Say, well, no, actually, what I meant is that sometimes you're a genius, but sometimes I don't understand what's going in your mind, which is quite different from saying you're stupid, right? So we did experiments and we showed that actually there is a difference. Not a huge difference, but a significant difference. So that's one of the projects. And the other one is Project Amore. It's on rephrase. So when you reformulate what you've said or what someone else has said, and how you can exploit that rhetorically. And so we started last year only, but we only have a few results that seem to show that when you are processing the discourse of someone who rephrases their words, for instance, you find that more persuasive than the same thing, but without a rephrase. And we're trying to see in what ways it's more persuasive, because we asked people how persuasive they thought the sentences would be, but that gives us an indication of perceived persuasiveness. You might think that this is persuasive, but in fact it's not. You don't really know. So now we have to dig deeper and try to come up with ways of showing why this is the case. So we're looking at reformulation. That second project is in collaboration with a team of linguists and philosophers at the Warsaw University of Technology in Poland. And so we have corpus linguists and computation linguists over there, and we're doing experiments, and we try to team up, trying to put these two methodologies together to know more about what rephrasing is. So those are the two research projects that I'm involved in.
And how with experience would you show that it was really persuasive?
You will be underwhelmed by my answer. We basically show people items of small pairs of sentences in contrast. So some of them contain a rephrase, some of them do not, or some of them contain one type of rephrase and the same another type of rephrase. And then we just ask people, how persuasive do you think this is? On a scale of not at all to very. And we have, 40 different items, and then we have 100 participants, and we make means, right? We calculate statistically. I don't know how to do that, but I have people. You want to do it, and we can show that there is a difference. So to the question, how persuasive do you find this to be, we have a few answers, and we're now testing whether that has to do with the image of the speaker. So you find that this is more persuasive because you feel that the speaker is more competent, perhaps. I don't know, rephrasing something or not rephrasing it might give you an idea. So imagine, you say, this is an issue of public health, and then you rephrase that by adding something very specific about some figures that you know or some study. That gives evidence that you know what you're talking about. And compared to someone who would say the same thing, but without that, it might be more persuasive. And that might have to do with the fact that you tend to believe the message more because you think that the source of the message is more competent. Right? So these are things we can measure. But we're only starting, so it's quite exciting. Yeah, those are the two projects I'm involved in at the moment.
Excellent.
Very interesting. I don't have any questions anymore.
You don't have any questions anymore. Thank you.
No
But I still have one last question to end this interesting interview. What would you have liked to know before you become a teacher, or what would you teach yourself when you were a student? What would be a tip?
Ask questions. Not, what does this mean? I mean, this you can ask, of course, but that's quite expected. But if you're interested in the job, if you're interested in what happens, just go to the people and ask questions. I said before, when I was a student, I didn't know what an assistant did. I didn't know what a professor did beyond teaching, for instance, or what the difference was between a lecturer and a professor. You can just ask people. The worst you can get is someone not having time for you or not answering your question, but then that doesn't change anything to the state in which you were before. So you can't lose anything, you can only win potentially something. And if you're interested, just go to the people and ask them. Usually people are very happy when others take an interest in what they do. So that's what I would say.
Well, you would have joined Unimix.
Maybe. Yes.
And asked more questions.
Like me.
Yes. Excellent. Well, thanks a lot for coming into your...
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And well, I wish you plenty of luck and happiness for the classes for the next semester.
Thank you. The same to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lou, for joining me.
Thank you for leading the interview.
Oh, and I'll see you guys really soon. See ya.
See ya.
Bye-bye.